Next, I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker, Chris Kresser. Chris is the co-director of the California Center for Functional Medicine, founder of Kresser Institute, creator of the award-winning and natural health website, chriskresser.com, and the New York Times bestselling author of The Paleo Cure and Unconventional Medicine. His podcast, Revolution Health Radio, has been one of the top 5 shows in the alternative health category in iTunes for the past several years. Chris's work is informed by his own experience recovering from a chronic, complex illness, which began while he was traveling in Southeast Asia in his early 20s. After seeing more than 20 doctors around the world and spending thousands of dollars in an effort to diagnose and treat his condition, Chris decided to take his health into his own hands. Through extensive study and research, continual self-experimentation, informal training in integrative medicine, he recovered from this debilitating illness and went on to share what he learned with others through his popular blog, podcast, and private practice. Chris is one of the most respected clinicians and educators in the field of functional medicine and ancestral health, and has trained over 1,500 clinicians and health coaches in his unique approach. He was recently named one of the 50 most influential people in health and fitness, along with Michelle Obama, Dr. Oz, Dr. Weil, Deepak Chopra, and Dr. Mark Hyman. We are so grateful that he chose to join us for this presentation this evening. Welcome, Chris.
Okay, so good to see you all. Let me just give me a second to get set up here. So we have a little bit of an unusual setup tonight. This computer is not connected to the screen. It's up there, so I'm going to do my best to manage with 2 hands through here. So if I start talking about something that is not at all connected to what you see on the slide, just raise your hand and I'll catch up. So we're going to start tonight actually I'm going to frame this talk in 4 categories. So the first is that chronic disease is the biggest challenge we face from a healthcare perspective by far. And it's a huge problem. We're only just beginning to understand how serious it is, and it really threatens to erode our quality of life and even bankrupt our country. The second is that chronic disease is common, but I would argue that it's not actually a normal state for human beings. The third is that our behavior and our environment, not our genes, it is the primary driver of chronic disease. And the fourth is that realigning our behavior and our environment with our genes is the most important step that we can take toward preventing and reversing chronic disease. So today, 60% of Americans now suffer from chronic disease. And 40% of Americans suffer from multiple chronic diseases. Just consider that for a moment. 40% of Americans suffer from multiple chronic diseases. Chronic disease is now responsible for 7 of 10 deaths each year. And it's not just affecting adults. The rate of chronic disease in kids has increased from 13% in 1994 to 27% in 2006. I haven't been able to find a more recent statistic, but it's almost certainly higher than that given the dramatic increase in chronic disease in adults. And this has been particularly notable for obesity, asthma, and learning disorders. 1 billion people now around the world suffer from diabetes, which is a combination of obesity and diabetes. 40% of Americans are now obese, and 100 million Americans now either have prediabetes or diabetes. That's 1/3 of the US population. Obesity has quadrupled in adolescents in the past 30 years. Almost 20% of kids between the ages of 6 and 11 are now obese in the US. Some estimates suggest that 1 in 6 Americans has an autoimmune disease. That's 50 million Americans, and this number continues to go up every year. According to the CDC, autism prevalence has more than doubled since the year 2000 alone, and this is not just because of increased rates of detection. Unfortunately, there's every indication that things are going to get worse before they get better. Today is the first generation of kids in modern history that are expected to live shorter lifespans than their parents. And as a parent myself, that's heartbreaking. If current trends continued, in 2 decades, 95% of Americans would be overweight and 1 in 3 would have diabetes. So the rise of chronic disease has a huge impact on patients. It erodes quality of life, it interferes with relationships and work, and it undermines confidence and autonomy. But there's also a tremendous economic cost to individuals. Medical expenses are now the #1 cause of bankruptcy, far ahead of credit card debt or student loan debt. Now, the economic implications of this are staggering. 90% of the $3.5 trillion that we spend per year on healthcare goes towards the treatment of chronic disease. Our annual healthcare expenditure is expected to hit almost 3.8 trillion in 2017, and about 25% of, and that constitutes about 25% of our gross domestic product. And it comes down to about $11,000 per year for every man, woman, and child in the US. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that if healthcare spending continues to increase at the current pace, it will consume the entire federal budget by the year 2035. So there'll be nothing left for education or defense or anything else. Globally, it's estimated that expenditures on chronic disease will reach nearly $50 trillion by the year 2030. Now, this is an almost incomprehensible number, but to put it in perspective, it's more than the GDP of the 6 largest economies in the world. So chronic disease has become so common, as I mentioned, 60% of Americans have one, that we now think of it as normal. But there's a big difference between something that's common and something that's normal. Contrary to popular belief, human beings are naturally vital and healthy when we live in alignment with our genes and our biology. It is not normal for us to develop multiple chronic diseases, especially at an early age, but even into our older years. So how do we know this? Well, here's an example. Consider a recent study of the Tsimane. They are a subsistence farming and hunter-gatherer population in Bolivia. They eat primarily meat and fish, fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and some starchy plants. They average about 17,000 steps or 8 miles of walking a day. They spend a lot of time outdoors. They get plenty of sleep. They aren't exposed to a lot of artificial light at night. Researchers found they have a prevalence of atherosclerosis that is 80% lower than ours in the US. And they did CT scans and found that nearly 9 in 10 Tsimane adults aged between the ages of 40 and 94 had completely clean arteries and faced essentially no risk of heart disease. And they estimated that the average 80-year-old in the Tsimane group had the same vascular age as an American in his or her mid-50s. So the Tsimane are not an exception. In fact, until very recently in our evolutionary history, they were the rule. Both our ancestors and contemporary hunter-gatherers were remarkably lean and fit and virtually free of chronic inflammatory disease. They were also superior to us in nearly every measure of health and fitness, from body mass index to blood pressure to insulin sensitivity to oxygen consumption to vision to bone density. Now you might be thinking, or you may have heard, so what? Maybe our hunter-gatherer ancestors and contemporary hunter-gatherers are healthier than we are when they're young, but they all die when they're 30. How many have heard this argument about hunter-gatherers? it's true that hunter-gatherers have shorter lifespans than we do in the industrialized world on average, but these averages don't consider challenges that are largely absent in our modern lives, like a complete lack of emergency medical, challenges that the hunter-gatherers face that we don't face, like a lack of emergency medical care, warfare, trauma, exposure to the elements, and high rates of infant mortality due to the lack of emergency medical care. So anthropologists have studied hunter-gatherer groups that have access to even the most rudimentary forms of medical care, like walking for half a day to a rural medical clinic. And what they found is that these groups have lifespans that are roughly equivalent to our own in the industrialized world. But the difference is they reach these older ages without acquiring any of the chronic inflammatory diseases that characterize our old age. They don't get obesity, they don't tend to get heart disease, diabetes, gout, hypertension, and even most forms of cancer. So the Tsimane are a really good example of this, but we also have groups like the Kitavans and the Tukasenta in the South Pacific, and then the Maasai and the Hadza and the Kungsan in Africa. So what happened? What transformed us from, there we go. What transformed us from a healthy, vital people that were, free of chronic disease to a sick, overweight, and unhealthy people? Well, as we're talking about tonight in the theme, it's not our genes. They're mostly the same as they were in the Paleolithic era. And people who are living in the industrialized world today have similar genes to hunter-gatherer groups like the Tsimane. I'm not saying that genes don't play a role, they absolutely do, but they're more important in determining what diseases we develop, not whether we develop disease in the first place. So if you took 10 Tsimane people or Maasai people, in the case of this picture, from their natural habitat where they live, and then you move them to New York City, for example, they won't all develop the same problems. 3 might develop diabetes, 3 might develop an autoimmune disease, 3 might develop a gastrointestinal disorder, 2 might develop depression, etc. And this explains why we see certain diseases clustering in certain populations. So an example of this would be that 80% of the population in American Samoa is now obese. And this increase happened in lockstep with the introduction of the standard American diet there. And this shows us that there's obviously something about their genes that predisposes them to develop obesity even more than the average American. Another example is that when people with a traditional diet and lifestyle move to the industrialized world and adopt an industrialized diet and lifestyle, they rapidly develop the diseases of civilization. And this has been observed with many different immigrant populations to countries like the US and the UK and Australia. So their genes haven't changed, but their environment and their behavior have. I think this is running out of batteries. Studies have also shown that our lifespan is primarily determined by our environment. There was a study published last year involving data from over 400 million people, huge data set, and it suggests that less than 10% of our lifespan is determined by our genes. So this means that our diet, our behavior, our lifestyle, all the things David was talking about, accounts for 90% of our lifespan. So all of this points to the same conclusion. Our behavior and our environment is the primary driver of chronic disease. And recent studies have supported this. One study published in PLOS found that 85% of the risk of chronic disease is environmental, not genetic. So 90% of lifespan and 85% of the risk of chronic disease. So why is this? Well, at one time, scientists did believe that our genes would hold the key to understanding and eventually preventing and reversing disease. The 20th century heralded the discovery of DNA, the polymerase chain reaction method or PCR method for amplifying DNA, and ultimately, of course, the complete mapping of the human genome. And this led to an era of what was called biological determinism, which is the idea that human health is entirely controlled by our genes. And that led to some pretty bold proclamations like this from Lord Sainsbury. We now have the possibility of achieving all we ever hoped for from medicine. And like this from Michael Dexter, mapping the human genome has been compared with putting a man on the moon, but I believe it's more than that. This is the outstanding achievement, not only of our lifetime, but in terms of human history. Unfortunately, that promise didn't really pan out. Before the genome was sequenced, scientists expected to find about 140,000 genes. The body makes 100,000 proteins, and then there are about 40,000 regulatory proteins needed to make other proteins, so they figured that they'd find one gene per protein, and that's 140,000 genes. So they were shocked when they discovered that humans have only 23,688 genes. If genes really do run the show, 24,000 is not only not enough to create our bodies and keep them running, it's not even enough to keep our brains functioning. And this was the first big clue that our genes are not running the show. And ironically, Craig Venter, who was one of the first people to sequence the human genome, was also one of the first to recognize the limitation of biological determinism when he said, we simply don't have enough genes for this idea of biological determinism to work. The majority of polymorphisms of single genes, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, are very common in the population, but most also have low penetrance, which means that they don't often manifest in clinical disease. So if it wasn't genes themselves that determined disease risk, scientists speculated that there must be some other factor, some way that the environment interacts with genes to influence risk. And this relationship between genes and environment is what is studied in the field of epigenetics, which literally means on top of epigenetics. So the simplest definition of epigenetics is changes in gene activity that don't involve alterations of the underlying genetic code, but still do get passed on to at least one successive generation. So we now know that our genes can be activated, turned on, or deactivated, turned off, by the environment outside of the cell. So this means the environment inside of the body, like biological, neurological, emotional, psychological influences, and the environment outside of the body, so things like our diet, our lifestyle, air quality, toxic burden, etc. And this activation and deactivation of genes has a far greater impact on our health than the genes themselves. And it's constantly changing based on the environmental factors, which are now collectively referred to as the exposome. So the exposome is a concept that was originally coined by the evolutionary biologist Christopher Wilde. And it refers to the sum of all non-genetic exposures in an individual lifetime from the moment of conception to the moment of death. It encompasses the food we eat, the air we breathe, our social interactions, our lifestyle choices, and our inherent metabolic and cellular activity. Now, there are three categories to the exposome. The first is the specific external. So these are things that are unique to us, but they're external to our body. So like our diet, the water we drink, our physical activity, the maybe personal care and home care products that we use. The second is the general external. So this is our broader environment, air quality, social interaction, climate. And then the third is our internal environment. So our metabolism, our hormones, our microbiome, inflammation, etc. So our DNA contains information that is waiting to be read and activated to create proteins, which in turn regulate every aspect of life. The DNA is covered in a protein sleeve that acts as a filter between the DNA strand and the cellular environment. So you can kind of think of DNA as a blueprint and the sleeve as the protective tube that an architect might use to carry the blueprint. Until the blueprint is removed from the sleeve, the DNA is latent. It's just potential information that hasn't been expressed as a protein. And this is where the exposome comes in. Exposure to factors either inside the body or outside the body, an emotion, a nutrient, a toxin, results in a chemical signal, like a neuropeptide being sent to the cell. And the signal travels inside of the cell, unwraps the DNA sleeve, and reads the information. Then RNA is produced from the regulatory protein reading the gene, and now the gene is expressed or activated. There are several specific mechanisms that affect gene expression, including DNA methylation, histone acetylation, chromatin remodeling, and non-coding RNA mechanisms. So we're not going to do a deep dive into all of these tonight, but let's take a closer look at DNA methylation as an example. If you remember back to high school biology, DNA has 4 nucleotides: cytosine, guanine, thymine, and adenine. And DNA methylation refers to the addition of a methyl group, which is 1 carbon atom bonded to 3 hydrogen atoms to the DNA strands themselves. So this has the effect of preventing the gene from expressing or from converting its information into instructions for making a protein or another molecule. So in other words, one way to think of DNA methylation is as an off switch, or perhaps a volume control where you turn down the volume. DNA methylation is vital to growth and development, stabilizing DNA and turning off potentially harmful genes and processes. And research has shown links between DNA methylation and everything from cancer to lupus to muscular dystrophy to congenital birth defects. So let's look at a couple examples of how the exposome can impact our health via DNA methylation. So air pollution has been shown to have several negative impacts on human health, and this is at least in part due to wreaking epigenetic havoc on our DNA. However, on the flip side, studies have found that taking B12 and folate and B6, all of which support methylation, can attenuate these effects. Another example is that low vitamin D in pregnant women is associated with poor fetal growth, childhood obesity, and low bone density. Key functions of the placenta, like transporting nutrients to the baby, are controlled by gene expression, which is in turn mediated by vitamin D. One study showed that short-term supplementation of vitamin D with vitamin D during pregnancy led to rapid changes in DNA methylation in the placenta, and it changed gene expression in the placenta by altering its methylation status. So unlike our genes, which of course remain the same throughout our life, changes in gene expression can happen very quickly. So in one study of about 30 men with prostate cancer, they followed an intensive diet and lifestyle regimen, and 48 genes that were related to tumor suppression were upregulated, and 453 genes related to tumor promotion were downregulated in just 3 months, a 3-month intervention. Another small study of 23 slightly overweight sedentary Swedish men found that adding a spinning or aerobics class just twice a week for 6 months altered over 7,000 genes, which is nearly a third of the human genome. So these studies document significant changes in gene expression in just 3 to 6 months, but more recent studies have shown that gene expression can change daily, or in some cases maybe even from moment to moment. But like genes themselves, changes in gene expression can also be passed on to future generations. Dr. Michael Skinner was the first researcher to show that changes in gene expression are heritable. He led a 2005 study that exposed pregnant rats to pesticides, and the male pups of the exposed rats had higher rates of infertility and decreased sperm production with epigenetic changes in 2 genes. Now, these epigenetic changes were present in 90% of the 4 subsequent generations of male pups, even though those pups weren't exposed to the pesticides themselves. There's also evidence that epigenetic changes are heritable in humans. One of the best known examples of this is the Dutch winter hunger cohort. So this is a group of people who lived through a period of famine in Holland during World War II from November of 1944 through May of 1945. And the food rations during that period were less than 1,000 calories a day. Babies that were in utero during that time experienced a wide range of effects later on in life, like higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. They were more likely to be infertile, and they had higher rates of personality disorder, depression, and psychosis. Identical twins are another example of the role of genes and gene expression. They have exactly the same genes, but not the same gene expression. This varies based on the environment, as we've seen. And a study out of Spain illustrated this well. They looked at 40 pairs of identical twins from 3 years old to 74 years old. And they found that younger twins with similar lifestyles and those who spent more years together had similar epigenetic patterns. And older twins, especially those with dissimilar lifestyles or who had spent fewer years together, had very different epigenetic patterns. This explains why identical twins don't have identical or exactly the same risk of disease. In fact, we see discordance rates of up to 50% in even highly heritable conditions like schizophrenia. This means that if one identical twin has schizophrenia, the other twin only has about a 50% chance of having it. So earlier I used the analogy of DNA as a blueprint. And of course a blueprint serves as the plan for a house or a building. It provides the basic structure and framework. But the houses that could be built from a blueprint could vary significantly, right? The builder might use different materials, different doors, windows, fixtures, paint color, etc. And all of these choices, of course, impact what the final building will look like. Likewise, our DNA provides a blueprint for our bodies, but the choices we make throughout our life, and even the choices our grandparents and parents made before we were born, influence how that blueprint manifests by changing the expression of our genes. So what does this all mean? Well, there's bad news and good news. The bad news is that choices our parents and our grandparents made before we were born affect our disease risk today. And the choices that we made, perhaps before our kids born or our grandchildren, if we have grandchildren, also affect their disease risk. But the good news is that, as you've seen, our genes are not our destiny. Changes we make today, tomorrow, in real time, affect our gene expression and health risk. So let's look at a few examples of this, starting with diet. Diet affects gene expression via several mechanisms. For example, studies have shown that certain dietary compounds bind to transcription factors and regulate their activity. Others have shown that different types and quantities of macronutrients affect gene expression. And diets that emphasize real foods have been shown to have numerous positive effects on gene expression. A 2013 study in the UK examined the effects of sleep deprivation on gene expression. They restricted sleep to 6 hours a night for 1 week in 26 healthy volunteers, and the control group slept for a full 10 hours a night. They found that over 700 genes were altered in the sleep-restricted group, and these genes were involved in everything from sleep homeostasis to the stress response to metabolism and even the regulation of other genes. A 2012 study in the journal Cell Metabolism found that vigorous exercise, even brief, can cause structural and chemical changes in DNA molecules within muscles. A 2014 study found that endurance training altered over 5,000 sites on the genome of muscle cells. A study at Ohio State found that stress affected more than 170 genes, completely shutting off 100 of them. On the other hand, in a study of meditation at Massachusetts General Hospital, novice meditators showed a change in about 1,600 genes. 874 were upregulated for health, and 687 were downregulated for stress. And seasoned meditators, those who were more experienced, showed a change in 2,200 genes, most of which were involved in improving the response to chronic stress. So now let's talk about what to do. which the solution that I refer to is realignment. So the evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky once said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." So what he meant by this is that all organisms have adapted to survive and thrive in a particular environment. And if you change the environment faster than the organism can adapt, you get a mismatch. And this mismatch is the primary driver of chronic disease. This is a core principle of evolutionary biology, and it applies to humans as much as it applies to any other organism in nature. So let's look at some of these changes that have caused this mismatch, starting with diet. Our ancestors, again, ate primarily meat, fish, fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and some starchy plants. These foods are nutrient-dense, low in calories, and anti-inflammatory. Now contrast that with today, when 60% of calories we consume in the US come from not just processed food, but ultra-processed food. And the top 6 foods in the American diet by calories are pizza, sugar-sweetened beverages, bread, grain-based desserts, chicken dishes, but primarily fried chicken dishes like chicken nuggets, and alcohol. Those are the top 6 foods by calories in the diet in the US. So these are nutrient poor, they're high in calories, and they're pro-inflammatory. Both our hunter-gatherer ancestors and contemporary hunter-gatherers walked an average of 10 to 15,000 steps a day, but this was punctuated by brief periods of more intense physical activity, like sprinting or lifting heavy things. And again, if you contrast that with today, the typical American walks an average of 5,000 or 6,000 steps per day and sits for an average of 60% of the day. Now keep in mind that's an average, so many people are sitting for much longer than that, 10, 12 plus hours a day. Sleep is another major difference. Hunter-gatherers sleep an average of 7 to 9 hours, and insomnia is almost non-existent. In fact, in the study I showed you before of the Tsimane people, they tried to ask them about insomnia, but they didn't understand because they didn't have a word for it in their language. So there was a communication breakdown there. In the US today, 1/3 of Americans are now getting fewer than 6 hours of sleep a night. And that's up from just 2% of Americans getting fewer than 6 hours of sleep in the 1960s. So that's a profound change in the last half century. And remember the study that I mentioned a few slides back, getting fewer than 6 hours of sleep for just 1 week in totally healthy volunteers led to significant changes in gene expression. So you need a bedtime, as David said. We also know exposure to artificial light at night is rare in hunter-gatherer societies, common in the modern world, profoundly impacts our circadian rhythm, which in turn influences nearly every system of the body, including brainwave patterns, hormone production, cell regulation, immune function, and metabolism. In fact, recent studies suggest that our circadian clock controls between 10 and 15% of our genome. So this explains why things like shift work, long distance travel across time zones, and abnormal light exposure are associated with everything from depression to obesity to cardiovascular disease to cancer. So there are, of course, many other differences between how hunter-gatherers live and how we live in the modern world, which include stress levels, social connection, and social structure, time for leisure and play, etc. But the crucial takeaway here is that when our diet and our behavior and our lifestyle are in alignment with what our genes and our biology have adapted for, we're naturally healthy and vital. And this is especially true if we have the added benefit of modern medical care for trauma, emergency, infection, and other times when things go wrong. So it follows that returning to this natural ancestral human template is the best way to prevent and even reverse chronic disease. So I'm not arguing we should recreate our Paleolithic lifestyle. You don't have to wear a loincloth or sleep out in the backyard to get the benefits of this, unless you want to. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's about bringing our modern habits into closer alignment with what we know works best for our genes and our biology. So, an example of that would be many of us use computers and tablets and phones and other devices at night, and these devices emit blue light. And blue light suppresses melatonin production, which makes it harder for us to fall asleep and stay asleep. And there are glasses that you can buy that have a special tint that filters out over 90% of the blue light emitted by these devices. And now, of course, many of these devices, the operating systems have, iOS has night shift where it naturally dims the screen at night and changes the color temperature so it doesn't emit as much blue light. So even technology companies have caught on to this. But there are other steps we can do like this that are pretty simple that can actually make a big difference. So how do we put all this together to improve our health and lifespan? Well, I'm going to make the same argument that David made, which is that focusing on the basics is by far the most important step we can take. So there was a large study published last year that showed that adopting just 5 health habits will extend lifespan by an average of 13 years. 13 years, that's not a small effect. So what were these habits? Maintaining a healthy body weight, getting at least 30 minutes of exercise a day, not smoking, not drinking excessively, and eating what they called a healthy diet, just a general healthy diet. And this study didn't look at sleep, but if they had, that would have increased the benefit even more. So these are simple things. It doesn't mean they're easy to do, but they're simple. We're not talking about super advanced strategies like intermittent fasting and ketogenic diet and high intensity interval training and pulsed electromagnetic field therapy and near-infrared sauna and all of this other stuff that we can get really interested in. These are just the basics. And doing these 5 basics adds 13 years to your lifespan. Unfortunately, according to the CDC, only about 6% of Americans consistently engage in the top 5 health behaviors. And in this case, they were exactly the same, except the CDC included sleep instead of healthy diet as a 5th behavior. So this slide right here is all we need to know about why we have a chronic disease epidemic. It's not a gene problem, it's a behavior problem. So start with the basics, healthy weight, not smoking, not drinking excessively, healthy diet, getting some exercise and getting enough sleep. That's 6 instead of 5, but those are just the absolute basics. And then once you've got those down, of course, also focusing on managing stress, reducing toxic burden, cultivating more pleasure. Humans are wired for pleasure, and our endorphin system is very important to our health. Connecting with other human beings. As David said, there's some incredible research on this. One study showed that lack of social connection is a greater predictor of early death and higher rate of disease than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Having time for play. Humans are also wired for play. It's not really a luxury. It's part of our genetic makeup. And spending time outdoors. These have all been shown to affect gene expression and our health span as well. So thanks for your attention. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit chriskresser.com, and if you're interested in functional medicine training for doctors and other licensed clinicians or health coach training, you can check out kresserinstitute.com. So I want to thank all of the folks at IHH for the fantastic work that they're doing in the world and for inviting me to speak here, and thank you all for coming tonight.